I need the money tomorrow. My wife ordered me, handing me her parents' debt of $750,000 and no delays, she added. I smiled and said, okay. A few hours later, I was at the airport. When she came home for the money, she found only a closed door and a box, which she opened and started screaming. You know that moment when someone mistakes your wallet for a magic lamp? Like they genuinely believe if they rub it hard enough, a genie is going to pop out and grant their wildest financial fantasies. Yeah, that was my Tuesday evening. Except instead of a lamp, it was my entire existence. And instead of 3 wishes, it was one very expensive demand wrapped in designer perfume and audacity. I was sitting in my home office minding my own business, trying to pretend that spreadsheets were interesting enough to justify staring at them for 6 hours straight, when I heard it. 3 loud knocks that hit my door like someone was announcing the apocalypse. Not the polite, "Hey honey, got a minute" kind of knock. No, this was the "I'm about to ruin your evening and possibly your entire financial future" kind of knock. The kind that makes your coffee taste bitter before you even take the next sip. My wife, Chloe, stormed in with the energy of a Category 5 hurricane, wearing Louboutins. Her heels were clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown to trouble. Each step a deliberate warning that whatever was about to come out of her mouth was going to cost me more than my sanity. She was waving a folder so thick it looked like it could choke a commercial-grade printer. And her face had that expression I'd come to recognize over the years, the one that said, "I've already made a decision and you're just here to fund it." "I need the money tomorrow," she announced. Not asked, announced, like she was reading a decree from some royal proclamation. $750,000 and no delays. She emphasized that last part like I was some kind of Amazon Prime package that better show up on time or there'd be hell to pay in the form of 1-star reviews and angry phone calls to customer service. She didn't ask me if I had it, didn't ask if it was convenient, didn't even bother with the courtesy of explaining what apocalyptic scenario required $750,000 by tomorrow morning. She just commanded it into existence, as if my bank account was some kind of voice-activated ATM that responded to her tone of desperation mixed with entitlement. I sat there for a moment, letting the absurdity of it all sink in like a stone, dropping into the ocean of my patience. Apparently, and I only knew this because she bothered to explain after I didn't immediately jump up and start printing money in the basement, her parents had decided to sink their entire life savings into a luxury furniture business that absolutely nobody asked for, wanted, or needed. We're talking about the kind of furniture that costs more than a car, but is somehow less comfortable than sitting on a pile of receipts from all your bad decisions. And now, surprise, surprise, they owed serious money to what Chloe delicately referred to as investors, which is rich people code for people who don't send friendly payment reminders. They send vans with guys named Rocco who have very persuasive methods of debt collection. I looked her straight in the eye, took a slow sip of my now cold coffee that tasted like disappointment and broken dreams, and smiled. Not a warm smile, not a reassuring smile. The kind of smile you give when you've just figured out the punchline to a joke that's been building for years. "Okay," I said, simply, letting that single word hang in the air like a piano suspended by dental floss. She blinked, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a genuine shock register on her face. She'd clearly prepared for an argument, maybe even a full-scale domestic dispute, complete with raised voices and slammed doors. She'd probably rehearsed her counter-arguments in the car on the way home, mentally preparing for my resistance, my questions, my very reasonable concerns about producing $750,000 overnight like I was some kind of financial magician. "Did you hear me?" she asked, her voice carrying that edge of suspicion that comes when someone agrees too easily to something unreasonable. "Loud and clear," I said, maintaining that same smile that probably looked more unsettling than reassuring. "I'll handle it." And I meant every word, just not in the way she was expecting, not even remotely close to what her entitled little heart was hoping for. She stood there for another moment, folder still clutched in her manicured hands, probably trying to figure out if I'd finally snapped or if I'd secretly won the lottery and forgot to mention it. When I didn't elaborate, didn't ask for details, didn't do anything except turn back to my spreadsheet like we'd just discussed what to have for dinner, she eventually left, heels clicking away with slightly less confidence than when she'd arrived. A few hours later, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across our overpriced house filled with overpriced furniture that her parents probably consulted on, I was at the airport, rolling my suitcase like a man who'd finally developed a severe and incurable allergy to stupidity. The terminal was buzzing with the usual chaos of travelers, but I felt oddly calm, like someone who just made the best decision of their life and was finally about to get some peace and quiet. The TSA agent looked at my ticket and then at me. "Business trip?" she asked casually, running my bag through the scanner. I smiled, that same smile I'd given to Chloe earlier, the one that knew something nobody else did yet. "Something like that," I replied. "More like a permanent vacation from bad investments and worse in-laws." She looked confused, but stamped my boarding pass anyway, probably used to travelers saying weird things at odd hours. As I walked toward my gate, rolling my suitcase behind me, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally dropped a weight I'd been carrying so long I forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. Tomorrow morning, Chloe was going to wake up expecting a miracle, expecting that magic lamp to produce her 750,000 wish. Instead, she was going to get something much better, much more educational, and infinitely more satisfying for me. She was going to get the truth delivered in a cardboard box with a bow on top. Because if she wanted everything by tomorrow with no delays, well, I was about to give her exactly that, just not the version she ordered. My flight was boarding, and as I handed over my ticket one last time, I couldn't help but chuckle. $750,000 by tomorrow morning? No delays. Sure thing, sweetheart. Your delivery is already being prepared, and trust me, it's going to arrive right on schedule. Let me explain Chloe's family before you start feeling bad for them, because I can already sense some of you out there getting all sympathetic, thinking maybe they're just down on their luck. Maybe they hit a rough patch. Maybe the economy screwed them over like it does to most honest, hard-working people. Let me stop you right there and save you the emotional energy, because these people aren't victims of circumstance. They're architects of their own financial disasters, and they've got the blueprints to prove it. Her dad, Robert, is the kind of guy who could sell ice to Eskimos if Eskimos were gullible enough to believe his pitch and didn't bother checking if the ice was actually frozen or just expensive water. With confidence, this man once, and I'm not making this up because reality is somehow stranger than any fiction I could create, tried to sell air purifiers that didn't actually purify air. Let that sink in for a moment. Air purifiers that didn't purify anything. They just sat there looking expensive and modern, humming with the sound of broken dreams and false advertising, making the room smell like regret mixed with that fake mountain breeze scent that smells nothing like any mountain I've ever been near. He sold maybe 12 units before people figured out their allergies weren't getting better and their cats were still making them sneeze. And by the time the complaints rolled in, he'd already moved on to his next brilliant scheme, leaving behind a trail of unhappy customers and a Yelp page that read like a crime scene report. Her mom, Deborah, treated credit cards like they were scratch tickets from the gas station, except with worse odds and higher interest rates. She had this philosophy, and I'm quoting directly here because I couldn't make this up if I tried, that money spent is money invested in happiness, which sounds almost profound until you realize she's saying this while buying her 4th designer handbag this month, none of which she actually needed or would use more than twice. She'd swipe that plastic like she was performing a magic trick, like the bill would somehow disappear into thin air or get paid by the tooth fairy or some other mythical creature that handles the debts of people who refuse to live within their means. Her wallet was like a graveyard of maxed-out Visas and MasterCards, each one a tiny tombstone marking another failed attempt at financial responsibility. And Chloe. Oh, sweet Chloe. She inherited their confidence, but not their caution, which is like inheriting a sports car but not the ability to drive or the insurance to cover it when you inevitably crash it into a ditch. She had her mother's spending habits and her father's ability to ignore reality, a combination that should probably come with a warning label and possibly require a license to operate in public. She could drop $5,000 on a handbag without blinking, but would lecture me about leaving lights on in empty rooms like that was the real drain on our finances. She had this remarkable talent for spending money we had on things we didn't need, while simultaneously panicking about money we didn't have for things her family absolutely shouldn't have invested in. I'd already covered her parents' medical bills, and not the normal, oops, I broke my arm kind of medical bills, but the, we decided to get experimental cosmetic procedures in a country with questionable medical licensing kind of bills. I'd pay for 2 so-called emergency vacations, because apparently when you're drowning in debt, the only logical solution is to fly to Cancun and drown in margaritas instead. And somehow that's supposed to clear your head and help you make better financial decisions. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. And then there was the suspicious business expansion in Italy that Robert pitched as a crucial networking opportunity to expand the furniture business into European markets, which translated from bullshit to English means it was just a 3-month wine tour where he and Deborah pretended to have meetings while actually just getting day drunk on Chianti and taking selfies in front of historical landmarks they couldn't name. The math was simple, painfully, brutally simple, the kind of equation that even a 5th grader could solve if that 5th grader had access to my bank statements and a basic understanding of cause and effect. Their debt equaled my exhaustion multiplied by infinity with a side of resentment and a garnish of wondering what the hell I was thinking when I said I do without including a clause about financial boundaries and the definition of emergency. Every time I thought we'd hit rock bottom, they'd somehow find a basement beneath the basement, a sub-basement of bad decisions that required my wallet to bail them out of. The moment she dropped that $750,000 bomb on my desk, like it was a casual request to pick up milk on the way home, I saw the pattern with crystal clarity, like someone had finally turned on the lights in a room I'd been stumbling around in for years. This wasn't new. This wasn't even surprising. This was just the latest, greatest, most expensive episode in a long-running series called How Much Can We Extract from This Guy Before He Finally Snaps? And I'd been the star of this show for way too long, playing the role of the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always comes through, the human safety net who catches everyone else while slowly tearing under the weight of their combined stupidity. I was never the husband in this relationship. Not really. Not in the way that matters. I was the ATM with emotional support features, the kind of machine that dispenses cash when you punch in the right code. Except the code was just showing up and demanding it with enough urgency and drama. I was the backup plan, the emergency contact, the guy whose name went on all the forms under financially responsible party, while they got to play fast and loose with reality and consequences. Her family had this remarkable ability to create crises out of thin air, like they were running some kind of disaster factory, and business was booming. They'd make decisions that any reasonable person would recognize as catastrophically stupid, then act shocked, genuinely, authentically shocked, when those decisions resulted in catastrophically stupid outcomes. And every single time, without fail, they'd turn to me with those expectant looks like I was supposed to pull a miracle out of my back pocket along with my checkbook. I'd spent years being the solution to problems I didn't create, funding lifestyles I didn't approve of, enabling behaviors that should have been stopped at the first red flag, which honestly appeared before I even proposed. But I was too young and stupid and optimistic to recognize it. I'd been the responsible adult in a family of perpetual teenagers who never learned that actions have consequences. Because I kept cushioning their falls, kept paying their bills, kept making their problems disappear with my credit rating and my savings account and my apparently infinite patience. But sitting there in my office, listening to Chloe demand $750,000 like she was ordering a pizza, something finally clicked into place. This wasn't going to stop. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't going to get better with time or communication or couples therapy. This was the rest of my life unless I did something about it. Unless I finally drew a line and meant it. By midnight, my plan was brewing in my head like the world's most satisfying cup of revenge coffee. The kind that keeps you awake, not because of the caffeine, but because of the pure adrenaline rush of finally doing something about a problem that's been festering for years. I was sitting in my office with the lights dimmed, my laptop glowing in front of me like some kind of modern-day war room. And I felt more alive than I had in months, maybe years. This wasn't anger. This wasn't spite. This was clarity. The kind of crystal clear thinking that only comes when you've been pushed so far past your limit that you loop back around to being completely calm and methodical. I wasn't going to yell or argue or throw things or have one of those dramatic confrontations you see in movies where people scream and cry and break expensive dinnerware. No, that's amateur hour. That's what people do when they're operating on emotion instead of strategy. I was going to educate. And education, my friends, is so much more effective than anger because it lasts longer and cuts deeper. You can forget a fight. You can move past harsh words, but you can never unsee the truth when it's presented to you in printed form with highlighted sections and footnotes. Years of marriage had taught me one thing, one absolutely fundamental truth about human nature that I should probably have recognized earlier, but better late than never. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, terrifies freeloaders like accountability. These are people who've spent their entire lives operating in the shadows of vague promises and convenient memory loss, always moving forward without ever looking back at the wreckage they've left behind. They thrive in chaos because chaos is hard to document, hard to track, hard to prove. But accountability, documentation, evidence, that's kryptonite to people who've built their entire existence on the foundation of "it'll work itself out" and "don't worry about the details." So I started building my masterpiece. And I'm not being dramatic when I call it that, because this was going to be beautiful, in the way that justice is beautiful, in the way that truth is beautiful when it's been hidden for too long. I grabbed a brown cardboard box from the garage, the kind that Amazon packages come in, completely unremarkable and innocent looking. If Chloe saw this box sitting by the door, she wouldn't think twice about it. She'd probably assume it was another delivery of something she ordered and forgot about, which happened approximately 3 times a week because online shopping was her therapy and our bank account was the copay. Inside this humble cardboard box, I was going to place a collection of documents that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. I started with copies of every single transaction I'd ever made for her family. And when I say every transaction, I mean I went back to the beginning, to the very first time Robert called me saying he needed just a small loan to cover an unexpected expense. I had kept everything. Not because I was planning this specific moment, but because I'm the kind of person who keeps records, who saves receipts, who believes in documentation, because memory is unreliable, but bank statements don't lie. I printed out screenshots of her mom's emergency spa receipts, and I put emergency in mental air quotes so large you could see them from space, because there is nothing, and I repeat, nothing, emergency about a hot stone massage and a seaweed wrap. An emergency is a heart attack. An emergency is your house burning down. An emergency is not deciding on a random Tuesday that your aura needs realigning and your chakras need balancing at a luxury spa that charges more per hour than most people make in a day. But Deborah had called it an emergency, had used that exact word with tears in her voice. And I'd paid for it, because that's what I did back then. I paid for things and asked questions later, usually too much later to matter.
I included her dad's fake business invoices, the ones he'd created for his various ventures that went nowhere, but somehow still required startup capital, operating expenses, and emergency funds. I had invoices for the air purifier business, for a brief stint trying to sell timeshares in properties he didn't own, for a pyramid scheme that he swore wasn't a pyramid scheme because it was shaped more like a diamond opportunity structure, and for at least 3 other enterprises that collapsed faster than a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Each invoice was a little monument to optimism without planning, confidence without competence, and an apparently limitless capacity to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. And then, because I'm nothing if not thorough, and maybe a little bit theatrical when the situation calls for it, I created a beautifully printed invoice of my own. I spent an embarrassing amount of time on the formatting, making sure it looked professional and official, using the same invoice template that Robert loved to use for his fake businesses. At the top, I put my name as the creditor and Chloe's entire family as the debtor. The itemized list was a work of art. Financial bailouts, $1,200,000. Emergency vacations and spa treatments, $350,000. Investment in non-existent business ventures, $850,000. Emotional labor and lost sanity, $100,000. Grand total, $2,500,000. At the bottom, in bold letters, I wrote, "Payment due upon receipt, no delays." Then I poured myself a whiskey, a good one I'd been saving for a special occasion. Leaving my marriage felt like a special occasion. The whiskey burned going down, but in a good way, in a celebratory way, in a here's to finally growing a spine kind of way. Then I opened my laptop and started booking a one-way flight. Because the thing about burning bridges is that you don't need a return ticket. At 3 a.m., I quietly rolled my suitcase through the hallway with the stealth of a man who'd finally figured out that sometimes the best argument is the one you don't have. The best explanation is no explanation at all. And the best goodbye is the one you don't say out loud. The wheels made this soft humming sound against the hardwood floor, and I found myself moving in slow motion. Not because I was having second thoughts, but because I wanted to savor every single second of this moment, this glorious moment of finally taking control of my own life instead of letting it be controlled by other people's disasters and demands. The house was dark, except for the neon glow of our expensive refrigerator that had more IQ points than my in-laws, more smart features than my marriage had red flags, and probably a better understanding of boundaries than anyone in Chloe's family tree. That fridge cost $4,000 because apparently regular refrigerators that just keep food cold aren't good enough anymore. We needed one that could connect to Wi-Fi, send us notifications about expiring milk, and probably judge our late-night snacking habits. Chloe had insisted we needed it, had actually used the word need like it was a medical necessity. And I bought it, because that's what I did back then. I bought things to keep the peace, to avoid arguments, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine when everything was actually a dumpster fire wrapped in designer labels. I left the box right at the entrance, positioned perfectly so it would be the first thing anyone saw when they walked in the door. I tied a little bow on top using some ribbon I found in the gift wrap drawer. Because if you're going to deliver a box full of financial truth bombs and documented evidence of years of exploitation, you might as well make it pretty. The bow was red, cheerful, the kind of bow you'd see on a birthday present or a Christmas gift, which made it even more perfect because Chloe was definitely going to feel like she'd received a present, just not the kind she was expecting or wanted or could return to the store for store credit. My flight to Seattle was at 6 a.m., which meant I had about 3 hours to get to the airport, get through security, and position myself far enough away that when the inevitable explosion happened, I'd be safely out of the blast radius. I'd chosen Seattle deliberately, carefully, after spending approximately 45 minutes researching cities that were far away, but not too far. Different enough to feel like a fresh start, but not so different that I'd feel like I was on another planet. Seattle had rain, coffee, tech jobs, and most importantly, it had approximately 2,800 miles between me and Chloe's next meltdown. At check-in, the airline agent was way too chipper for this hour of the morning, one of those people who apparently wake up with sunshine shooting out of their various orifices and enthusiasm for life that seems almost offensive when you've been awake for 24 hours planning your escape from a toxic marriage. She looked at my ticket, then at me, probably noticing that I had the expression of someone who is either running away from something or running towards something, and in my case, it was definitely both. "Business or pleasure?" she asked, with that standard customer service smile that's been practiced in front of a mirror about 10,000 times. I smiled back, and I could feel it was one of those smiles that doesn't quite reach your eyes, because your eyes are too busy calculating freedom and distance and the exact moment when your phone is going to start exploding with angry calls and text messages. "Revenge therapy," I said, and I wasn't even joking. I was being completely honest, because that's exactly what this was: therapeutic revenge. The kind that's been prescribed by years of being underappreciated and financially drained, and the dosage was one cardboard box taken first thing in the morning on an empty stomach of expectations. She laughed like she thought I was joking, stamped my boarding pass, and told me to have a great flight. I wondered if she'd remember this interaction later, if she'd see the news stories or social media posts and think, "Oh, damn, that was the revenge therapy guy." But probably not, because airline agents see hundreds of passengers every day, and most of us blur together into one giant mass of people trying to get from point A to point B without losing our minds or our luggage. As I sipped coffee in the lounge, the kind of mediocre airport coffee that costs $7 because they've got you trapped and you're desperate for caffeine, I imagined Chloe waking up in a few hours. I could picture it so clearly. It was like watching a movie in my head, and it was going to be the best movie I'd never actually see in person. She'd wake up with her alarm, probably hit snooze twice because she always did, finally drag herself out of bed with that slightly annoyed expression she always had in the mornings before her coffee and makeup transformed her into the polished version of herself that she presented to the world. She'd go through her usual routine, probably spending 45 minutes on skincare and hair because heaven forbid she face the day looking anything less than Instagram ready. And then she'd come downstairs full of confidence, expecting to see me sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and a bank transfer confirmation ready to go. She'd probably already planned how she was going to call her parents with the good news, how she was going to be the hero who saved the day, how grateful they'd all be that she'd married someone with deep pockets and apparently no spine. Instead, she was going to see that box, that beautiful brown cardboard box with its cheerful red bow, and her smile was going to die instantly. She'd approach it confused at first, maybe thinking I'd gotten her a gift as some kind of weird apology for not being enthusiastic enough about bankrupting myself for her family's terrible business decisions. She'd tear into it with those perfectly manicured nails that cost more than most people's car payments, and then her entire world was going to tilt sideways. The smile would die, the confidence would evaporate, the realization would hit her like a freight train made of receipts and reality checks. She'd flip through page after page of documentation, seeing in black and white exactly how much money had flowed out of my accounts and into her family's endless pit of financial irresponsibility. She'd see her mother's spa days, her father's failed businesses, the vacations, the emergency loans that were never paid back, the casual requests that turned into thousands of dollars over the years. And then she'd find my invoice, that beautiful invoice with its itemized list and its grand total of $2.5 million. And she'd read the note. You wanted everything by tomorrow. Congratulations, you're right on schedule. And that's when the screaming would start. I could already hear it in my imagination. That particular pitch that Chloe hit when she was really, truly upset. Not the fake upset she used to manipulate situations, but the genuine upset that came from being confronted with something she couldn't charm or cry or demand her way out of. It was going to hit such a high frequency that dogs 3 blocks away would start howling in sympathy. Car alarms would go off, and even our smart refrigerator would probably register it as some kind of emergency alert. Oh, she was going to scream. She was going to scream so loud that the neighbors would consider calling the police. And then she'd probably call me, and then her parents, and then probably a lawyer, and then maybe her therapist if she had one, which she should have had years ago but refused to get because she didn't believe in therapy. She believed in shopping, complaining, and making other people solve her problems. According to my smart doorbell footage, and let me just say that the $99 I spent on that Ring camera was the best investment I ever made because it's given me more entertainment value than Netflix, HBO, and Disney Plus combined. She arrived at exactly 9:10 a.m., looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine spread about women who have their lives completely together. Her hair was perfect, not a strand out of place, styled in those effortless-looking waves that actually take 45 minutes and 3 different products to achieve. Her expression was smug. That particular brand of smugness that comes from believing you've won before the game even starts. The kind of confidence that's about to get shattered into approximately 8 million pieces. I was sitting in the Seattle airport by this point, my connecting flight delayed by 30 minutes, which was normally the kind of thing that would annoy me, but today felt like a gift from the universe because it meant I had extra time to watch this unfold in real time. I had my phone out, the Ring app open, volume turned up as high as it would go without disturbing the other passengers who were sitting around me looking equally annoyed about their delays. I probably looked insane, grinning at my phone like a maniac, but I didn't care because this was about to be better than any movie, any TV show, any form of entertainment that Hollywood had ever produced. "Babe," she called out as she walked through the door, her voice echoing through the house with that casual expectation that I'd be there, ready and waiting with a solution to all her problems. She said it the way you'd call out for someone you expected to answer, not with any real concern or worry, just that automatic greeting that married people do when they come home. No answer came, obviously, because I was approximately 3,000 miles away sipping overpriced airport coffee and living my best life. But she didn't seem concerned yet. She probably figured I was in my office or in the shower or somewhere else in the house doing whatever it is she assumed I did when I wasn't actively solving her family's financial disasters. Then she saw the box, and I watched through the grainy doorbell camera footage as her entire demeanor changed. She stopped walking, tilted her head slightly like a confused puppy seeing its reflection for the first time, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head trying to figure out what this was. Her first instinct was probably to assume I'd ordered something, because in her world, boxes just appeared on doorsteps full of things people bought online without thinking twice about it. But then she noticed the bow, that cheerful red bow I'd tied on top, and her expression shifted from confused to cautiously optimistic. She squatted down in those expensive heels that probably cost more than my flight to Seattle, the kind of designer shoes that are beautiful but completely impractical for anything resembling actual movement or comfort. And she tore the tape with those perfectly manicured nails.
The sound of the tape ripping was captured perfectly by the doorbell microphone, that satisfying screech of packing tape being pulled away, and I felt this little surge of anticipation, knowing that in about 5 seconds, her entire morning was about to derail spectacularly. She unfolded the flaps, reaching inside with this expression that was half curious and half excited, probably still thinking this was some kind of surprise gift. Maybe an apology present for not being more enthusiastic about bankrupting myself for her parents' furniture fiasco. Her hand pulled out the first document, and I watched as her eyes scanned the page, watched as her face went from excited to confused to slowly, gradually horrified. The smile died instantly, just completely evaporated from her face like someone had hit a kill switch on her happiness. It was beautiful in the way that karma is beautiful, in the way that natural consequences are satisfying when they finally catch up to people who've been running from them for years. Her mouth opened slightly, forming this little O shape that would have been conical if it wasn't so perfectly timed with my expectations of how this would go. "What? What is this?" she mumbled, more to herself than to anyone else, since she still didn't realize I wasn't home. Probably wouldn't be home ever again if I had anything to say about it. She was flipping through printed receipts of her family's shopping sprees, and I could see the moment each one registered in her brain. The spa receipts where her mom had declared an aura emergency, the business expenses for her dad's air purifier scam, the vacation costs for their Italian wine tour disguised as a business expansion. Every single page was another nail in the coffin of her assumption that I was just going to hand over $750,000 without question or consequence. Her dad's company name appeared on multiple documents right next to his offshore gambling losses that he'd somehow neglected to mention when he was asking me for loans to save the business. I'd done my homework, had actually hired a private investigator for 2 weeks just to confirm my suspicions, and boy, had that been money well spent. Because it turned out Robert wasn't just bad at business, he was actively terrible at hiding his terrible habits. The man had been gambling online at 2 a.m. on weeknights, betting on sports teams he'd never heard of in countries he couldn't locate on a map, losing thousands of dollars with the same confidence he used when pitching his ridiculous business ideas. Then she found the note. My beautiful, carefully crafted note that I'd spent probably too much time writing and rewriting until it had just the right amount of sarcasm mixed with finality. She read it out loud, her voice getting higher and more strained with each word. "You wanted everything by tomorrow. Congratulations, you're right on schedule." The scream that came out of her mouth was something special, something I don't think I'd ever heard from her before in all our years of marriage. It wasn't the frustrated scream she'd use when traffic was bad or her favorite restaurant was booked. It wasn't the angry scream she'd deploy when I forgot to pick up her dry cleaning or double-booked over one of her brunch plans. This was a primal scream, the kind that comes from deep in your chest when you realize you've been completely and thoroughly outmaneuvered. When the reality you thought you were living in suddenly reveals itself to be completely different from actual reality. It hit such a pitch that I had to pull my phone slightly away from my ear even though I was listening through the speaker. The other passengers in the airport waiting area definitely noticed at that point because several people looked over at me, probably wondering what kind of horror movie I was watching that could produce that kind of sound effect. One older lady actually looked concerned, like she was considering asking if I was okay. But I just smiled and gave her a thumbs up because I was way better than okay. I was experiencing pure, unfiltered joy. Even Alexa apparently registered the scream because I could hear in the background, faintly through the doorbell mic, our Amazon Echo responding with its slightly confused robot voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat your question?" Which was probably the most accidentally hilarious thing Alexa had ever done, responding to a scream of existential horror like it was a misunderstood voice command for checking the weather or setting a timer. Chloe dropped the papers, and they scattered across our expensive marble entryway like the world's most expensive confetti. Each page a little monument to years of taking advantage of someone's good nature and deep pockets. She put her hands on her head, fingers tangling in that perfectly styled hair that was about to get significantly less perfect, and just stood there for a moment, looking like someone who just realized they'd bet everything on red and the ball had landed on black. By noon, I was sitting in a restaurant in downtown Seattle, eating the fluffiest, most perfectly golden pancakes I'd ever had in my entire life. And I'm not exaggerating when I say they tasted like freedom with a side of maple syrup. The restaurant was one of those trendy brunch places where people line up around the block on weekends. The kind with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and a menu that uses words like artisanal and locally sourced without a trace of irony. Normally, I'd roll my eyes at this kind of place, but today, everything felt different, lighter, like someone had removed a 200-pound weight from my shoulders and replaced it with actual, functional happiness.
I had my phone propped up against the little metal napkin holder, watching Chloe's meltdown go viral in real time. And let me tell you, the internet works fast when there's drama involved. Apparently, in her panic and fury and complete inability to process what was happening, she decided that the best course of action was to record an angry Instagram video because nothing says "I'm handling this maturely" quite like putting your emotional breakdown on social media for the entire world to see. She positioned her phone at that slightly upward angle that everyone uses when they're trying to look their best, which is hilarious because no amount of strategic camera positioning can make you look good when you're mid-meltdown. The video was a masterpiece of unintentional comedy. She was tearful, mascara starting to run just slightly in the corners of her eyes, her voice doing that shaky thing that happens when you're trying to cry and talk at the same time. It was the full performance, the complete "how could he do this to me" routine that she'd probably practiced in her head without realizing how it would actually come across to people who didn't already have a vested interest in taking her side. She talked about betrayal and abandonment and how she couldn't believe someone could be so cruel. And conspicuously absent from this entire monologue was any mention of the $750,000 she demanded or the years of financial support I provided to her utterly hopeless family. The comment section wasn't kind, and I spent probably 40 minutes just scrolling through them with a grin on my face that probably made me look unhinged to the other brunch customers. The internet has this beautiful way of cutting through bullshit with surgical precision, and the people watching this video weren't buying what she was selling. "Sis, he didn't leave you, he escaped," read one comment with about 15,000 likes, and I wanted to find that person and send them a thank you card because they'd summed up my entire situation in 7 words. Plot twist, he paid her back in trauma, was another gem, sitting at the top of the comment section with hearts and laughing emojis multiplying by the second. Someone else had written, "This is what happens when you marry for money and forget the prenup clause," which was fascinating because we actually did have a prenup that Chloe had insisted on back when she thought she was going to be the one with more money, back before her family's various business ventures collapsed like a series of increasingly expensive dominoes. That prenup was looking pretty good right about now, sitting in a lawyer's file somewhere, protecting the assets I'd worked for from the family that treated my bank account like a community resource. People were doing deep dives in the comments, sharing their own stories of being financially drained by in-laws and irresponsible partners, creating this weird support group in Chloe's comments section that was definitely not the sympathy party she'd been hoping for. Someone had even created a hashtag Box of Truth, which was already trending in the local area and spreading outward like a financial justice wildfire. The hashtag was full of memes, people sharing their own experiences with entitled family members, and an uncomfortable amount of accurate speculation about what exactly had been in that box. Her family started panicking, and I knew this because my phone started blowing up with calls from numbers I'd blocked months ago, but had apparently found new phones or borrowed someone else's device to try to reach me. Her dad's phone line disconnected, which I discovered when I unblocked his number just for the entertainment value of seeing if he'd try to call. The number just went straight to that automated message that says, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service," which meant either he'd rage quit his phone carrier, or, more likely, he hadn't paid his bill and they'd finally cut him off. Either way, it was poetic. Her mom posted a prayer emoji marathon on Facebook, which I saw because we were still technically friends on there, even though I'd muted her posts years ago to preserve my sanity. It was just row after row of praying hands emojis. Like if she posted enough of them, God would personally intervene and make this whole situation disappear. She'd written something vague about family going through trials and testing our faith, as if this was some kind of natural disaster that had randomly struck, instead of the completely predictable consequence of years of financial irresponsibility and entitlement. The comments on her post were mostly from her church friends offering thoughts and prayers, which is nice and all, but notably doesn't come with a cash value that could help pay back the money they owed to actual dangerous people. Meanwhile, I was ordering extra syrup because nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, tastes sweeter than poetic justice served with a side of blueberry compote. The waitress brought over a whole little pitcher of warm maple syrup, and I drowned those pancakes like I was drowning my old life in delicious breakfast condiments. Each bite was better than the last. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't just because the restaurant knew how to cook pancakes. It was because I was eating them as a free man, as someone who'd finally stopped setting himself on fire to keep other people warm. I took a photo of my pancakes, perfectly plated with fresh berries and a light dusting of powdered sugar, the morning light streaming through the window hitting them at just the right angle. I posted it to my own Instagram, which I rarely used, but figured this occasion warranted breaking my social media silence, with the caption, "Sometimes the best decision you can make is the one that looks selfish to people who are taking advantage of you. Also, these pancakes are incredible." Within minutes, the post had more engagement than anything I'd ever shared, with people I hadn't talked to in years coming out of the woodwork to leave supportive comments and fire emojis. Someone commented, "Living well is the best revenge, but those pancakes are a close second." And I laughed out loud in the middle of the restaurant, causing a few people to look over. I didn't care. I was done caring about what people thought, done worrying about maintaining appearances, done playing the role of the responsible one who always came through. If people wanted to judge me for walking away from a toxic situation, they could judge all they wanted from the cheap seats while I sat here in Seattle eating pancakes that cost $17 and worth every single penny. My phone buzzed with a notification that Chloe had posted a follow-up video, apparently doubling down on her victim narrative, but I didn't watch it. I'd seen enough, gotten enough satisfaction from the initial meltdown, and now it was time to actually move forward instead of dwelling on the past. 2 days later, my lawyer, Thomas, called, and I could hear the amusement in his voice before he even said hello. That particular tone lawyers get when they're about to deliver news that's professionally interesting and personally entertaining. Thomas had been my attorney for about 5 years, handling everything from my business contracts to the prenup that Chloe now probably regretted insisting on. And he was one of those guys who'd seen enough crazy situations that nothing really surprised him anymore. But this apparently was special enough to warrant a personal call instead of just an email update. "You sure you're not coming back?" he asked, and I could hear him shuffling papers in the background, probably my file, which had gotten significantly thicker over the past 48 hours. Thomas had that old-school lawyer vibe where he still preferred physical documents over digital files, kept everything in manila folders that he'd label in his barely legible handwriting. And I'd always found it charming in a weird way, like he was cosplaying as a lawyer from a 1970s legal drama. "Not unless it's for the movie rights," I said. And I wasn't entirely joking, because at this point, the way things were unfolding, Hollywood was probably already optioning this story. I could see it now. Some dramatic thriller about a man who escapes financial abuse with nothing but a cardboard box and a flight to Seattle, starring someone moderately famous who'd win awards for portraying my particular brand of exhausted sarcasm.
They'd probably change the ending, make it more dramatic, add a car chase or something, because apparently real life isn't exciting enough, even when it involves fleeing your marriage in the middle of the night with receipts as your only weapon. Thomas laughed, that deep chuckle that suggested he'd seen some things in the past 2 days that were going to make this conversation very interesting. "Well, you might want to sit down for this one," he said, which is never a good sign, but also sometimes is a great sign, depending on which side of the situation you're on. And in this case, I had a feeling I was on the entertaining side. "Apparently," he continued, and this is where things got really interesting, in that I told you so kind of way that's incredibly satisfying when you're proven right about people being terrible. Chloe's family business got audited. Not randomly audited, not routine audited, but specifically audited by people who had questions about where all the money was going and why the numbers didn't add up, and whether this was actually a legitimate business or just an elaborate front for siphoning money from investors who were now understandably upset about the whole situation. Thomas laughed, that deep chuckle that suggested he'd seen some things in the past 2 days that were going to make this conversation very interesting. "Well, you might want to sit down for this one," he said, which is never a good sign, but also sometimes is a great sign, depending on which side of the situation you're on. And in this case, I had a feeling I was on the entertaining side. "Apparently," he continued, and this is where things got really interesting in that I told you so kind of way that's incredibly satisfying when you're proven right about people being terrible, "Chloe's family business got audited. Not randomly audited, not routine audited, but specifically audited by people who had questions about where all the money was going and why the numbers didn't add up, and whether this was actually a legitimate business or just an elaborate front for siphoning money from investors who were now understandably upset about the whole situation." The IRS had gotten involved, which is never a good time for anyone, but especially not for people who've been playing fast and loose with the concept of business expenses versus personal spending. Apparently, Robert had been writing off everything as a business expense: the Italian wine tour, the luxury furniture in their personal home that was supposedly display inventory, Deborah's spa treatments that were allegedly wellness expenses for maintaining a professional appearance, and even their country club membership that was theoretically for networking purposes, but was actually just so Robert could play golf and complain about his back nine performance. But here's where it got really good. The kind of good that makes you want to pump your fist in the air and yell, "Justice!" like you're in some kind of legal procedural TV show. Their so-called loans weren't actually loans at all. They were disguised luxury spending that they'd been trying to pass off as legitimate business debt. And guess whose name they tried to use as a guarantor without his knowledge or consent? That's right, yours truly. The guy who was currently sitting in a Seattle apartment eating takeout Thai food and living his best life approximately 3,000 miles away from this disaster. They'd forged my signature on documents, which is a special kind of stupid because we live in the digital age, where handwriting analysis is a thing, and also I have copies of my actual signature on file with multiple banks and legal institutions. They put my name down as a co-signer for loans I'd never agreed to, used my credit score without permission to secure financing for their ridiculous furniture venture, and generally committed enough fraud to make a white-collar crime prosecutor salivate with excitement about their conviction rate statistics. But here's the beautiful part, the part that made me actually laugh out loud when Thomas told me, the part that proved that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor and timing. I'd already changed accounts, revoked all access, moved my assets into protected trusts, and basically disappeared from the financial grid as far as they were concerned. Every account they'd had access to was closed. Every credit card with my name attached was canceled. Every automatic payment that I'd been making for their various expenses was terminated. I'd spent the last 2 days systematically dismantling any financial connection I had to that family. And I'd done it with the kind of thorough precision that made Thomas actually say the words, "I'm impressed," which, coming from a lawyer who'd been practicing for 30 years, was basically the equivalent of a standing ovation. The prenup that Chloe had insisted on, the one she demanded back when we first got married because she was convinced her family's business ventures were going to make her independently wealthy and she wanted to protect her assets, that prenup was now protecting my assets instead. It clearly stated that any debts incurred by either party without the explicit written consent of the other party were that person's sole responsibility, which meant that all of Robert and Deborah's business disasters, all of their fraudulent loans, all of their luxury spending disguised as business expenses, none of it could touch me. I was legally, completely, totally in the clear.
Thomas chuckled again, and I could hear him taking a sip of what was probably his third coffee of the day, because lawyers run on caffeine and billable hours. "You basically disappeared like Batman," he said, "but with receipts instead of a cape and a much better paper trail." I appreciated the superhero comparison, though I'd argue that Batman had it easier because he just had to fight criminals with elaborate-themed gimmicks. He didn't have to deal with in-laws who thought a luxury furniture business for a market that didn't exist was a solid investment strategy. Meanwhile, Chloe was now trending online under the hashtag Box of Truth, which had taken on a life of its own in ways that I don't think anyone could have predicted. People were creating memes, writing think pieces about financial abuse in marriages, sharing their own stories of toxic family dynamics and the importance of boundaries. Someone had created a TikTok explaining the whole situation with receipts and documentation that they'd somehow pieced together from Chloe's public social media meltdown and public records. And it had millions of views. There were podcast episodes being recorded, relationship counselors using this as a case study, financial advisors warning people about the dangers of enabling family members' irresponsible spending habits. The story had taken on this weird viral life, where it wasn't even really about me and Chloe anymore. It had become this larger conversation about accountability and boundaries, and what happens when you finally stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. People were picking apart every aspect of the situation, analyzing Chloe's Instagram videos frame by frame, finding inconsistencies in her narrative, discovering public records that showed her parents' history of failed businesses and unpaid debts going back years before I ever entered the picture. Thomas sent me a few of the news articles that had picked up the story, because apparently local news had nothing better to do than report on viral relationship drama, and the headlines were spectacular. "Man leaves marriage with box of receipts instead of alimony," read one. "Husband's gift to wife exposes years of financial exploitation," read another. My personal favorite was "The box that ended a marriage and started a movement," which felt a bit dramatic, but also kind of accurate, given how many people were now talking about financial boundaries in relationships. 1 week later, my phone buzzed with that particular vibration pattern that means someone who's not in your contacts is trying to reach you. And in my experience, unknown numbers are either spam calls about my car's extended warranty, or people I specifically don't want to talk to who figured out that I've blocked their regular number. I was sitting in my new favorite coffee shop in Seattle, one of those local places that takes their coffees so seriously, they have a dedicated barista whose entire job is just steaming milk to the perfect microfoam consistency, when I saw "unknown number" flash across my screen. For a moment, I considered just letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me. And also, I'd had 2 excellent espressos already, so I was feeling confident and slightly wired in that way that makes you think you can handle anything the universe throws at you. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards, and the person on the other end is probably holding a losing hand and a whole lot of regret. "Hello?"
I said, keeping my tone neutral and pleasant, like I was answering a call from someone trying to schedule a dentist appointment rather than from someone who'd spent the last week having a very public meltdown across multiple social media platforms. It was Chloe, and I knew it was her before she even spoke because I could hear her breathing. That particular rhythm of someone trying to compose themselves before launching into a conversation they've probably rehearsed in their head about 50 times. Her tone was the emotional equivalent of burnt toast. That specific quality of something that started out with potential but has been left unattended for too long and is now just bitter and charred and, frankly, inedible. It was the voice of someone who'd been crying, then angry crying, then rage posting on social media, then crying again, and was now trying to pull together some shred of dignity for this conversation. "You humiliated me," she snapped. And there it was, jumping straight past hello, straight past any attempt at civility or pleasantries, right into the accusation like we were picking up a fight that had been paused rather than starting a new conversation. Her voice had that edge of self-righteous fury that suggested she genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation. That somehow my decision to document years of financial exploitation and leave instead of bankrupting myself for her parents' terrible business decisions was the real crime here. "Technically," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee for dramatic effect, even though she couldn't see me, "you humiliated yourself. I just provided supporting documents." I kept my voice calm, almost cheerful, because nothing irritates angry people more than someone who refuses to match their energy, who stays collected while they're losing it. It's like trying to start a fire with wet wood. No matter how much heat you apply, it's just not going to catch. "You think this is funny?" she demanded, her voice going up an octave in that way it did when she was really working herself up, when she was transitioning from regular angry to the kind of angry where she'd start saying things she'd later claim she didn't mean but absolutely did mean in the moment. I could picture her pacing, probably in her parents' house, since I doubted she was still living in our place, wearing a path in whatever expensive carpet they'd bought with money they didn't have. I paused for effect, letting the silence hang there for just a beat longer than comfortable. "Hilarious," I said, and I meant it too, because at this point, after everything that had happened, after watching her viral meltdown and the subsequent discovery of her family's fraud and the beautiful karmic justice of it all, it had transcended regular funny and entered the territory of cosmically hilarious. It was the kind of situation that you'd read about and think, there's no way that's real. Except it was real, and I was living it. And it was absolutely, undeniably hilarious. There was silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that's louder than words because you can feel the fury radiating through the phone. I imagined her standing there, phone gripped so tight her knuckles were probably white, trying to formulate a response that would make me feel guilty or ashamed, or whatever emotion she was hoping to extract from this conversation. But I was 3,000 miles away, sitting in the sunshine with excellent coffee, and I'd spent the last week sleeping better than I had in years, so guilt wasn't really on the menu. Then I heard it, the sniffles. The slight catch in her breathing that meant tears were either actively happening or about to happen. And this was the part where she'd try to pivot from anger to sadness, from attacking to playing the victim, because that's what people do when their first emotional strategy isn't working. "We lost everything," she said, her voice smaller now, trying to sound broken and vulnerable in a way that would have worked on me a year ago, maybe even a month ago, but definitely wasn't working on me now. I sighed, not because I felt bad, but because this was so predictable it was almost boring. "Chloe, we didn't lose everything," I said, emphasizing the we to make it clear that there was no we anymore. That ship had sailed, and I was the one who'd bought the ticket and burned the dock behind me. You still have your parents' vintage ego collection, which, based on current market value and the fact that it's apparently indestructible despite all evidence to the contrary, should be worth at least several $1,000,000 in sheer audacity alone.
I could hear her sharp intake of breath, that little gasp that meant I'd hit a nerve, struck right at the heart of what was actually bothering her. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the fact that I'd stopped playing my assigned role, stopped being the safety net, stopped enabling the whole dysfunctional family circus that had been running for years, with me as the primary sponsor and apparently the only person who thought it was insane. "How can you be so cruel?" she asked. And her voice was genuinely confused now, like she actually couldn't understand how I could be making jokes when her world was falling apart. She really, truly believed that I was the villain in this story, that my crime of stopping the money train was worse than years of taking advantage of my good nature and deep pockets. It was fascinating in a clinical sort of way, this complete inability to see her own role in how we'd ended up here. "Cruel would have been staying," I said, and my voice was serious now, not joking anymore, because this needed to be said clearly. "Cruel would have been continuing to enable your family's financial disasters and pretending like it was normal or sustainable or my responsibility to fix. Cruel would have been teaching you that this behavior is acceptable and that there are no consequences for treating people like ATMs with feelings. What I did was set a boundary. Probably should have done it years ago, but better late than never, right?" She didn't have a response to that. Or, if she did, she didn't want to say it, because the silence stretched out between us like a chasm that no amount of words was going to bridge. I could hear her breathing, uneven and shaky, and I knew she was crying now. Real tears, not strategic tears. And part of me, a very small part that still remembered the person I'd married before everything went sideways, felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been sympathy, if sympathy wasn't exhausted from years of being the only emotion I was allowed to have in this relationship. "This isn't over," she finally said, and her voice had that edge of determination that suggested she was already planning her next move, already thinking about lawyers and arguments and ways to spin this situation back in her favor. "Actually," I said calmly, "it is. It's been over for a while. We were just the last ones to figure it out. Well, I figured it out. You're still working on it, apparently." She hung up without saying goodbye, and honestly, I wasn't surprised, because Chloe had never been good at endings, had always preferred to just leave things unfinished and dangling rather than actually closing chapters properly. I looked at my phone screen for a moment, watched it fade to black, and then I did something I probably should have done years ago. I blocked the number. Added it to my ever-growing list of blocked contacts that included her parents, her siblings, and various family friends who tried to reach out on her behalf with messages about working things out and family values. I turned off my phone completely, not just silent, but actually powered down, because I was done with this conversation, done with this chapter, done with being available for people who only called when they needed something. The barista caught my eye and asked if I wanted a refill, and I said yes, because I had nowhere to be and nothing to do except sit here in the sunshine and enjoy the sound of silence that comes from finally putting your own needs first. Seattle became my new home, and not just in the logistical sense of this is where my mail gets delivered now, but in that deeper way where a place actually fits you instead of you constantly trying to contort yourself to fit into it. I rented a small apartment with a view of the bay. Nothing fancy or Instagram-worthy, just a simple one-bedroom with hardwood floors that creaked in a charming way and windows that actually opened, which felt revolutionary after living in a house where everything was automated and climate-controlled and basically designed to make you forget that weather existed outside your perfectly temperature-regulated bubble. The apartment was in one of those older buildings that had character, which is real estate code for things don't always work perfectly, but it has charm, and I loved every imperfect inch of it. The refrigerator made a humming sound that was slightly louder than it should be. The bathroom tiles were original to the building, probably from the 1960s, in this mint green color that should have been hideous but somehow worked. The neighbors were a mix of young professionals and older folks who'd lived there for decades, and nobody cared about impressing anyone. Nobody was competing over who had the better car or the more expensive watch, or whose vacation photos got more likes on social media. I started a consulting gig, something I'd been thinking about doing for years but never had the mental energy to actually pursue because all my energy was being drained by managing other people's crises and disasters. Turns out, when you're not spending 40 hours a week being someone's emotional support ATM, you actually have time and brain space to focus on your own career and interests and goals. The consulting work was in my field, helping small businesses with their financial planning and strategy, which felt deliciously ironic given that I'd just escaped from a family that thought financial planning meant hoping really hard that money would materialize when you needed it. My clients were people who actually wanted help, who took my advice seriously, who implemented the strategies I suggested, and then came back with results and gratitude instead of new problems and demands. It was shocking how much I enjoyed working with people who valued my expertise instead of just viewing me as a resource to be extracted. I set my own hours, worked from coffee shops or my apartment, and sometimes from the park when the weather was nice, and I made enough money to live comfortably without the constant anxiety of wondering when the next financial emergency would hit. I rediscovered peace, which sounds dramatic, but I'm being completely serious when I say I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Peace, it turns out, is waking up on a Saturday morning without immediately checking your phone to see if someone's texted you about an emergency that requires your immediate financial intervention. Peace is eating dinner without mentally calculating how much this meal costs compared to how much you've already spent this month on other people's problems. Peace is going to bed at night without that knot in your stomach that comes from knowing you're living a life that doesn't actually align with your values or desires. I learned that silence is powerful, more powerful than any argument or explanation or attempt to make someone understand your perspective when they're fundamentally incapable of seeing past their own needs. You can't argue with someone who's already gone, and there's something beautifully final about that, something clean and decisive that doesn't leave room for the endless back-and-forth negotiations that never actually resolve anything. Silence says, I'm done engaging with this dynamic, in a way that words never quite can, because words invite response and debate and the possibility of being worn down over time. Friends asked if I'd ever forgive Chloe, and I appreciated that they asked instead of just assuming I should or lecturing me about the importance of forgiveness like it's some kind of moral obligation regardless of circumstances. These were my real friends. The ones who'd watched me slowly disappear into my marriage over the years, who'd bitten their tongues and tried to be supportive while clearly seeing that something was deeply wrong with the whole situation. Now, they were asking if I'd forgive her, and I could tell they were genuinely curious about my answer, not judging, just wondering. Sure, I said, leaning back in my chair at the bar where we'd met up for drinks, surrounded by people who actually cared about me as a person rather than as a financial solution. As soon as my laughter stops echoing in her mansion of regrets, I'll consider forgiveness. So, probably never, but, never say never. They laughed because they knew I was half joking and half serious. That particular combination of humor and genuine feeling that real friendship allows you to express without judgment. The truth was, forgiveness felt like the wrong word for what I was experiencing. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't dwelling on what had happened or plotting revenge beyond the extremely satisfying box of receipts that had already been delivered. I was just done, completely and totally finished with that chapter of my life. And moving forward without looking back didn't require forgiveness. It just required commitment to my own well-being and boundaries. Forgiveness implies that someone did something wrong and you're choosing to let it go. But what I was doing was recognizing that I participated in an unhealthy dynamic for too long, and I was choosing something different now. She sent one last message weeks later. and I only saw it because I'd unblocked her number briefly to check if she was still trying to contact me. Morbid curiosity getting the better of me one evening when I'd had a glass of wine and was feeling reflective. The message was short, accusatory, and completely lacking in any self-awareness. "You ruined my family." I stared at it for a moment, sitting on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, the glow of the screen the only light in the room as evening settled over Seattle outside my windows. I could have ignored it, could have blocked the number again and never responded. But something about the sheer audacity of that statement demanded a response, required one final clarification before I closed this door permanently. I replied, and my response was even shorter than her message, just 11 words that contained more truth than all the conversations we'd had over the years combined. No, I just stopped sponsoring it. There's a difference. I hit send, then immediately blocked the number again, this time with the kind of finality that comes from knowing you've said everything that needs to be said, and anything more would just be repetition. Her family wasn't ruined because of me. Her family was ruined because they'd built their entire existence on a foundation of other people's money and questionable decisions. And eventually, that foundation crumbled, the way unsustainable things always do. I just happened to be the support beam that finally said enough and stepped away. And yes, that meant the structure collapsed. But that's not the support beam's fault. That's the architect's fault for designing something that couldn't stand on its own. I started going to therapy, which was something I'd considered before but never prioritized because I was always too busy dealing with everyone else's problems to address my own. My therapist was this middle-aged woman named Dr. Patterson, who had an office that smelled like lavender and always had a box of tissues within arm's reach. And she had this way of asking questions that made you realize things about yourself that you'd been avoiding for years. We talked about boundaries and codependency and the difference between being helpful and being enabling. And slowly, I started to understand how I'd ended up in that situation in the first place. Turns out, I had this thing where I equated my value with my usefulness, where I believed that being loved meant being needed. And Chloe's family had recognized that vulnerability and exploited it, probably not consciously or maliciously, but exploited it nonetheless. Dr. Patterson helped me see that real love doesn't demand constant sacrifice, that healthy relationships involve reciprocity and respect, and the understanding that everyone's needs matter, not just the loudest or most persistent person's needs. It was revolutionary, honestly, this idea that I could say no to things without being a bad person, that I could prioritize my own well-being without being selfish. 3 months later, I stood at the same airport where it all began. Except this time, I was flying for pleasure instead of escape. And let me tell you, there's a world of difference between those two experiences. I was heading to Portland for a weekend hiking trip with some new friends I'd made through a meetup group. The kind of spontaneous plan that happens when you're not constantly budgeting for other people's emergencies and can actually afford to live your own life. Chloe's parents declared bankruptcy, which I learned through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances who still felt the need to keep me updated even though I'd made it clear I didn't care. Apparently, the luxury furniture business collapsed spectacularly, taking with it their savings, their credit, and whatever dignity they'd managed to maintain through years of terrible decisions. The investors they owed money to were not amused. And last I heard, Robert was working at a big-box hardware store, explaining the difference between wood stains to customers who definitely didn't need his level of unwanted expertise. Chloe reportedly moved in with her aunt and started selling motivational mugs online. Those generic inspirational quote mugs that say things like, "Family first" and "Blood is thicker than water," which was so ironic it almost felt like performance art. I almost bought one just for the sheer entertainment value of drinking my morning coffee from a mug that said "Family First" while sitting in my peaceful Seattle apartment, completely free from family drama.
Almost, but not quite, because that would have required me to visit her online store, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of even a single page view. Sometimes I re-watch the doorbell footage from that morning, not out of spite or bitterness, but as a reminder that freedom has a soundtrack, and in my case, it was her scream echoing across the porch when she opened that box. It was my screensaver for a while, just the frozen frame of her face mid-realization, which probably made me seem petty to anyone who saw my phone. But I didn't care, because it reminded me of the exact moment I took my life back.
Now, when people asked about my marriage at parties or networking events, I smiled and delivered my standard line with perfect comedic timing. It ended with a box, and that's the first time she ever opened something I gave her willingly. The joke always landed. People always laughed, and sometimes someone would recognize the story from social media, and we'd have a whole conversation about boundaries and financial abuse and the importance of knowing when to walk away. Then I'd raise my coffee or my beer or whatever I was drinking at the moment and toast quietly to myself. To peace. To humor. To walking away without paying a dime more than I already had. To freedom. To boundaries. To the revolutionary act of choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to choose them. To cardboard boxes and receipts, and the beautiful finality of closing a door that should have been closed years ago. The plane was boarding, and as I walked down the jetway toward my weekend of hiking and laughter and living a life I actually enjoyed, I felt lighter than air, like I'd finally figured out the secret that took too long to learn. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in your own peace of mind. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all for people who never appreciated you in the first place.